Wow. Well, we all witnessed history today. That got pretty heated there for at least a few instances, but I think we all witnessed history today. That was the first time that a orthodox to mainstream academic archaeologist has ever actually gone on a huge platform to debate somebody in the ancient civilization theorist community like Graham Hancock. While there were a couple of personal feuds that they had to sort out, I thought it was pretty productive, and I hope that it's the beginning of a positive trend of people from both schools of thought being able to have a discourse with one another, because I think that the arguing and the bickering back and forth during this debate was kind of evidence for the fact that dehumanization from each side towards the opposite side, right? I mean, they get into it, and we'll get into it, but these orthodox mainstream archaeologists often kind of, even if they know it's not true, they throw Hancock in with the, white supremacist, white Atlantean savior race. And then, guys like Graham Hancock don't necessarily have a bad problem painting archaeologists with a broad brush either, right? So there were some weeds there to sort of pick through, but I think that ultimately it was a positive conversation. So I hope that this eventually leads to maybe a new age of a discourse between orthodox academics and sort of skeptic academics or independent researchers, right? This video is going to be almost as informal as the debate was. I wrote down a whole plethora of notes that I'd like to go over and just kind of give my thoughts on. We're just going to talk about at least the first half of the debate. So just to start it off, I was caught completely off guard when Flint shows that first round of artifacts. He kind of brought it back around to make sense, but when he shows the ancient Greek vessels that were imported to Italy, I was like, whoa, what? This took a turn all of a sudden. I thought that it was an interesting place to start. But he eventually brought it back around to making sense as to what the whole point of archaeology was. And I thought that his beginning, while a little bit strange at first, ended up being strong. But one of the things, when you get past that, one of the things that I thought was really interesting at the very beginning of the podcast was how he thought it was very strange that how nautical archaeological sites can be preserved, meaning ships that are sunken underwater, specifically ships in the Aegean. He was saying that sometimes Roman ships are sunken and then buried so quickly, if they're not in a tidal zone where they're going to be thrown around on the base of the sea floor, that if they're covered up quickly, they'll be preserved so well that even the nets on Roman boats from 2,000 to 2,500 years ago are still preserved. Now, I thought that maybe he didn't deliver this in the right way to be a counter to Hancock. What he was sort of saying was that if there were ships going all around the world, somewhere you would find these ancient vessels that were 10,000 years old. And in some cases, they would sink and they would quickly be covered up by the sea or ocean floor. And they would be so well preserved that you would still be able to find them intact 10,000 years later. That's what he was getting at. But I think that with kind of Hancock interjecting, maybe that point wasn't delivered properly. But I thought that was an amazing point, and it was something that I hadn't considered, because I had just thought that if there were ships back then and they were made of wood, there would be no remnants of them today. But to my amazement, from Flint's initial presentation, that's not the case. There would actually be ships that are still preserved. So I thought that was an excellent counter to Hancock's global civilization idea. We haven't found any of these 10,000 plus year old ships that would be able to carry hundreds of people, right? We find some indigenous ships in the Americas, these long canoes that are 10,000 years old, but nothing large enough to carry hundreds of people or even dozens of people. Now, Flint also says that archaeologists don't have a problem with changing paradigms or having making paradigm shifting discoveries. That is the goal. That's the dream of so many archaeologists. And I agree with him. I don't think that your average archaeologist ever enters into this secret cabal that is being paid off to withhold global ancient secrets, right? That's not happening. But What I do think that Flint sort of neglected to acknowledge is the fact that there are people specifically in, let's say it like it is, specifically in Egypt. There are people in positions of power that purposely withhold findings, and they purposely do not allow information to be published to protect a black market trade of antiquities. So there's billions of dollars wrapped up in being able to suppress new digs, new sites that are discovered, to protect a extremely profitable racket. And this isn't just happening in Egypt, this is happening all over the world. That's just one example of the corruption. There's tons of other examples, but we'll get into that. Now, this is kind of disorganized. This is just me jotting my thoughts down, but Hancock says somewhere in there that, of course, not all archaeologists are caught up in this global conspiracy, and he doesn't think that there is a global conspiracy, and he doesn't think that there's a conspiracy against him specifically. But he does say, which I agree with, that some archaeologists can be extremely vindictive, extremely hateful, and they don't really have a problem, perhaps not in the field, but in an informal sense, don't really have a problem painting people who disagree with their personal theories or their life's work as being something that they're not. Case in point, John Hoops, who I think is, one of the most vehement examples of an archaeologist, he willfully paints Hancock in this light of being a, white supremacist, racist, even a Nazi, and which is just 100% not true. So I do agree with Hancock there that and I've had experiences with John Hoops and with some people in his corner that are just 100% totally unprofessional. And so I do agree with Hancock here. So to follow that up, Hancock also shows a video of an archaeologist who was studying the Clovis people, admitting that all around the world, so many archaeologists were very supportive of his work. However, he experienced that North American archaeologists were very stiff and rigid and unwavering in their beliefs and not really willing to hear him out. And that not only that, but that they were ridiculing him and making fun of him. This is 100% true. I mean, in the early 1900s, when there was the debate back and forth between whether the Olmecs came first or the Maya came first, that is a great example. That whole history is a great example of the vehement, totally unprofessional behavior that can happen in archaeology. But the thing is, it's not archaeology, it's people, right? I mean, in any industry, you're going to have people behaving like this. It's, you wouldn't think that the majority of archaeologists are somebody that you would send your kids off to stay with them for a week. So it's not just archaeology, it's human beings in general. Human beings in general behave like this across all industries. Archaeology just happens to be the topic at hand. To follow that up, Hancock shows the Society of American Anthropology, which Flint is a member of, submitted a letter to Netflix asking them to either cancel his show Ancient Apocalypse or have it recategorized into being science fiction, which is essentially taking away all of the weight of Hancock's show and his theories and the research that he's done, which is, essentially getting something that's nonfiction, having it characterized as science fiction. That's essentially canceling it, right? Or stripping it of all of its credibility. Then they get into Hancock's presentation where he's talking about, he makes some good points that the Sahara and the Amazon, they are direct opposites of each other, but one similarity that they have is that only less than 1% of the entire region has been properly surveyed, let alone archaeological digs been performed. But when they're performed, they find amazing things. And so Hancock turns to Dibble and he says, has an adequate amount of the Sahara or the Amazon been surveyed? And just to remind you that the Sahara is almost the size of the United States and the Amazon may be bigger than the United States itself. So you have these giant gaping blind spots in the archaeological record, and he's saying, has an adequate amount of these two regions been surveyed for you to be able to honestly say that there is no possibility of an ancient lost civilization? And to that, Flint kind of beats around the bush and doesn't really answer it. He says, a lot of it has been surveyed, including being surveyed by Flint Dibble's dad, who was a prominent archaeologist. So he kind of beats around the bush and doesn't answer that, and eventually Graham answers that, and he says, listen, if the Sahara and the Amazon each only have been surveyed, just less than 1%, you cannot say without a shadow of a doubt that there is no existence of a lost civilization. Does that have anything to do with Graham's idea of a global civilization? No, it does not. Because we know for a fact that there were lost civilizations in the Amazon. It's very evident when you study archaeological finds coming out of the Amazon influencing Shavin de Hontar and the rest of Andean culture, that there is a culture that has that same jaguar-fanged deity iconography coming out of the Amazon, but we don't really know where that comes from. You look at the adventures, the explorations and expeditions of Percy Fawcett. He was trying to find these ancient civilizations whose ruins were near the Xingu people or the Xingu people in the Mato Grosso region of Brazil. So you had the Xingu people living sort of at the base of the hills on which these ancient civilizations were built that are being discovered by LiDAR 100 years later. So we know that there were lost civilizations in the Amazon. Were there lost civilizations in the Sahara? That's harder to say because it's harder to live. It's much harder to live in the Sahara. There could be lost civilizations there prior to 6000 BC, but it would take a tremendous amount of money and survey work to be able to prove that, although I think it's pretty possible. I mean, you have this giant, vast region in northern Africa that was once green, which isn't very far from where the Homo sapiens came out of. I would say it's pretty likely that a civilization, multiple civilizations of some kind, existed out there. Did those civilizations have a global network? Well, that's a whole other leap, right? So he's right in one sense that you can't say it's not possible for there to be a lost civilization, but were those lost civilizations global? Well, how do you prove that? That's kind of what this whole debate is about. Now, I don't know a lot about Yonaguni. I think that's how you pronounce it. These nautical archaeological sites, or maybe geological sites, as Flint seems to suggest that they are, off of the coast of Japan or those Polynesian islands. I don't really know much about that, and I'm not going to comment too much on it, but it was a really interesting segment, and Graham showed some photos of some geological features that certainly looked like they were perfectly flat, had 90-degree angles. They looked really, really man-made to me. I thought that was pretty interesting, but of course, there are some strange things that happen in geology that make things look man-made a lot of the times. They touch on Bimini Road too, which I don't know how I feel about Bimini Road. At first glance, it looks man-made, but what he was showing at Yonaguni looked a lot more man-made. So they kind of get into it there. There was not really a consensus at the end. Of course, they don't agree at the end of really any of these topics, but I didn't really know how to feel about it. The underwater sites off the coast of Japan certainly looked very man-made to me. They were also similar to sites that are above water in Japan or somewhere in those islands off of the Western Pacific, so I'm not really sure how I felt about that. But that kind of rolled into Graham Hancock relating the stonework at those sites to the stoneworks at Sacsayhuaman, which is in Peru. Then it really got heated because Flint said that no, they don't look anything like Yonaguni or Yoganuni or Yamahudi. I don't know how to say the name, but he said that they don't look anything like that. And Graham said, "Oh, really? Have you been to Sacsayhuaman?" And Flint says, "No, I haven't." And he's like, "Well, you really can't really talk about it much then, can you?" I think Graham was getting a little bit too heated there. I mean, that's not a good argument. I can kind of understand. I mean, there's so much nuance that's at these archaeological sites. It's hard to make an expert, fully definitive statement if you haven't been there, and I think that's where that line was. You can talk about things without having been there. Hell, I talk about Egypt all the time, and I haven't been there yet, but hopefully I will go this year. If not this year, it'll be the beginning of 2025. But I talk about Egypt all the time. The problem is I don't make definitive statements as to what Egypt does or doesn't look like, especially not in a situation like that where I'm debating somebody who's been to the site in question multiple times. I don't make a definitive statement in contradiction to somebody who's been there multiple times because I just assume that I don't know the nuances and the different angles that you don't see in all the photos. I don't know that like the person that I'm debating against or that I would be debating against. So I think that's where Graham got heated. He just instantly went, oh, well, if you haven't been there, you can't really talk about it. I agree. I also disagree, but it's okay. It just got heated, and Rogan kind of simmered it back down. So taking it back to Bimini Road, Flint actually makes a awesome counterpoint to this that I agree with, actually. He showed a road in Romania that he had excavated, and he took a photo during the excavation, and you saw all these little artifacts, pottery shards, a variety of other things that were found amidst the blocks of the road, right? And which none of that is found at the Bimini Road. And I thought that was a great point. You see these underwater submerged nautical sites, and you don't really find any artifacts. And he also talks about how there are underwater cities off the coast of Greece that have sunk over time. And when they do dives there, they discover artifacts after artifacts after artifacts, whether it's pottery shards or little statuettes, little pieces of jewelry. They discover a lot. They even discover the remains of crops and food. So none of that is found at Bimini Road in particular. I can't say about the other Japanese sites. And I thought that was a great point. However, Graham does counter that, and he says, well, hey, we refer to it as Bimini Road because that's what it's known as culturally, right? Pop modern culture calls it Bimini Road. I'm not saying it was literally a road. It just looks like an ancient large stone structure to me, which I thought was a good counter there. Thinking back to it right now, it doesn't really refute the idea that, well, you would find cultural artifacts there, right? So I kind of lead towards Flint on this, on Bimini Road. It seems like Bimini Road is something that's really close to the heart for Graham, and so I understand, him championing that as being a human-made structure, but I'm just not so sure. Again, the sites that were off the coast of Japan, wow, that looked very, very, very man-made to me, especially because it looked exactly like other sites that were above ground in the same region. So following that, Flint starts to get into his area of expertise, which is following agriculture and following ancient crops. And he says that you can see the evolution, this is getting back into South America, but he says that you can see the evolution of agriculture and of the cultivation of indigenous crops in the Amazon on the peripherals of the Amazon, which is true. And he uses this as a rebuttal to Graham Hancock's idea that, well, a civilization must have brought this knowledge there, but yet you do see on the peripherals of the Amazon. So you have, if you go on Google Maps right now, you see this big dark green area where the Amazon is. The Amazon actually used to be quite a bit larger than that, but on the peripherals of the Amazon, there are these geometric earthwork civilizations, and that had these incredibly large farmlands. They're amazing sites. The thing is, I don't know that using these civilizations on the peripheral of the Amazon is a good rebuttal to Hancock's global civilization idea. And he's essentially saying that the cultivation of these crops happened much later, perhaps starting at around 8500 BC. That's not Flint's number. That's my number from the research that I've done on the Amazon. That's when that starts, and that's a bit after, potentially 1,000 to 3,000 years after, the beginning of the Younger Dryas to the end of the Younger Dryas. And so I don't know that is a good rebuttal to Hancock's global civilization idea. And what I mean by that is that the Amazon today, and it was even bigger then, in ancient times, the Amazon was considerably larger, maybe 1.5 times larger than the modern day United States. So, just think about how long it would take you to walk from one side of the United States to the other, and imagine all of that is just jungle. To judge, when cultivation started by an entire continent based on the peripherals of the jungle, I don't know that you can do that accurately, and I don't know that that's an accurate view as to when civilization and the cultivation of crops began in South America. If you go to the center of the jungle, there would probably be finds there that really change the way that we view ancient South America. And there's probably the remnants, I think, that a lot of civilization and a lot of the cultural iconography and the religion and the science of botany comes out of the Amazon. I think it might be the most ancient place of Central and South America. But for me, I think that almost certainly. So I don't think that was a great refutation to Hancock's idea of a global civilization being involved in South America. So then Flint says, after Graham has talked about the Amazon, and he said that he hopes that more and more excavations will be done, because while they've only excavated or surveyed about 1% along the peripherals of the Amazon, every time they move forward, they find amazing earthworks. There are these geometrical, astronomically aligned earthworks on the peripheral of the Amazon, and they found almost 10,000 of these things just on the peripheral. So we have no idea what the Amazon likes when you go deeper. And he's saying he hopes that funding will come in and we'll be able to learn a lot more. And then Flint says, hey, I just want everyone to know that I'm not against that. I do hope that the funding comes in. And if people want to donate to organizations that are influential in these areas, or will be able to put the money towards new excavations, he says that you should donate to the Society of American Anthropology, which I guess Flint forgot. That's the organization that wrote the letter to Netflix to get Graham Hancock canceled. And they had just talked about that, 10 or 15 minutes before. So that's the dilemma. I mean, I think that hopefully this was I hope that this opened up a new chapter, a new phase or era of possibility where people on two different sides of the aisle can come together and speak. But the problem is that you have these organizations that have already reached out to try to get Hancock canceled. And, how do you work together? How do you work together from that point on? It's possible. It's surely possible. But what I think should have been done from the very beginning is that these organizations should have seen Hancock as somebody who, yes, perhaps he's antithetical to our ideas, but let's not attack him. Let's try to find a way to be mutually beneficial, because Hancock, let's be real, he's a businessman, he's an entrepreneur, as well as an enthusiast of the ancient world. He loves the ancient world, but he's a businessman. So provide some kind of opportunity for him to be able to sell and tell his theories, and then use that as a funnel for funding. Work together in some way. There is a way to get that income over to these archaeological sites. So they should have been working together from the beginning. And these organizations should have seen people like Robert Schoch, John Anthony West, Robert Bauval, whole cast of them, should have seen them as being useful rather than attacking them. And that attack has created this snowball effect where nothing productive is happening between the two sides other than dehumanizing each other. And so you get to this debate, and they put some screenshots of Flint Dibble's tweets from, let's be honest, they're back in 2022, I believe. And that's not that long ago, but it's before he ever met Hancock. And so when you meet somebody, they become human. And some of the tweets about Hancock, not really talking about him as though he's this monolithic figure and pop culture society, which is true, but also not treating him like a real person. And so I imagine that probably after they've met, you're not going to see that kind of exchange between Graham and Flint, because they're now human to each other, right? They met and they had a debate. They kind of had it out about some of these little petty things. But after this, hopefully it's going to be a new chapter, and hopefully it sets up a new chapter in the future. But both sides have to, show some humility and come together. So Flint, he gives an interesting presentation where he says that according to the archaeological evidence on the coastlines of the major continents, there isn't any archaeological evidence that shows any room for a major agricultural society during the time of the Ice Age or shortly afterwards. However, while that is pretty compelling, at least at first, Graham Hancock has a good rebuttal, and he says that, well, how can you say that, with 100% confidence when less than 5% of the coastlines around the earth have been surveyed and excavated, which is a great point. And have they excavated key sites that would really give us a better indication of whether or not there were global societies? I mean, this is kind of the thing about this global civilization theory. I've been thinking about this. I'm 26 now. I read Fingerprints of the Gods when I was 16. And something that I've thought about for the last 10 years, there are things that Graham gets right, And there are things that I think that even he will change his mind on over time. I think that when you look at places like ancient Egypt, that is not the best indication of an ancient lost civilization. And I don't know if that's where I would look for one. And so when you see archaeological digs being done on the coastlines around the Mediterranean or on the coastlines of some other places around the world, I don't know that they're even looking at a place that could give us a good indication of whether or not there were global societies during the Ice Age or, hell, even after the Ice Age. I don't know if those kind of projects have gone on. And I think that we're reaching a point where guys like Hancock represents a whole generation of independent researchers, right? You have Hancock, Schock, John Anthony West, Robert Temple. You have a whole slew of them. And I think that they have awoken an entire younger generation of people to this idea that everything is probably not exactly as it seems. And this is also permeated into archaeology as well. And so I think that it's possible that because of these guys, we're going to discover a lot more along the way that is maybe somewhere in the middle. That's just my own personal theory about this. But I think that Graham has a perfect rebuttal to that in saying, well, how can you definitively say that when only 5% of the coastlines have been surveyed and even less percentage of that have actually been excavated? That's very true. There are probably other places around the world that would have finds that would surely be paradigm shifting, I'm sure. So I was actually surprised that they dived into my realm of expertise. It was like it came out of nowhere. They were talking about Gedung Padang, and all of a sudden they brought up the Olmec heads, and maybe it was Joe that brought up the Olmec heads, which was just, I'm sitting there at my computer listening to it at 1.5 times speed, trying to get through it to hear the whole thing. And all of a sudden I've got to slow it down and hear what they're talking about, the Olmecs. But Joe and Graham kind of played into the idea that the Olmec heads certainly don't look traditionally Native American, right? They don't look traditionally Mexica. And they say, well, possibly they look African. Possibly they look Polynesian of some kind or Australasian of some kind. And, of course, Flint is there, and he's like, no, not really. And they kind of brush over to that, and they quickly get to Quetzalcoatl. So the thing I want to say about the Olmecs is when I first read Fingerprints of the Gods, there's a section in here called the Olmec Enigma. And somewhere here at the beginning of the book, I'm not going to completely go into it, but Graham Hancock does sort of flirt with the idea that the Olmecs are potentially the descendants of some civilization from Africa. I thought that for a little while, and then I became a Mesoamerican anthropologist and quickly learned that that wasn't actually the case. So yes, but yes, the Olmec heads do look African. They do look Polynesian, but they look much, much, much more like the men that live in modern-day Veracruz, Mexico. Last month with Dr. Ed Barnhart, we were on a Olmec expedition. We were going to see every single Olmec head and do some research on the nuances of the Olmec civilization. It's the strangest, probably most mysterious civilization, one of the most mysterious civilizations in the entire world. I would put it at top 5. And when we knock on this little museum in Jalapa, I think, or maybe it was Tlaxcala, we knock on this little museum door, and no one had been there in 4 or 5 days. And the man who opens up the door, to my surprise, is this 6'4" kind of hefty guy whose head was an Olmec head. He looked exactly like the Olmecs. The only difference was he had really, really short hair. But he had the chubby face, the big lips, the big nose. He looked literally exactly like an Olmec head. Sometimes you have to find photos of the right African person that looks like an Olmec head, or sometimes you have to find the photo of the right Polynesian person, and maybe it looks like it, but it won't look like the other Olmec heads. This guy looked like the stereotypical Olmec head facial features that you see everywhere. And so it was overwhelmingly clear to me while I was there that these heads were nothing other than Mesoamerican, which, I mean, I've been thinking that for years, but definitely seeing that man in person as soon as we arrived in Veracruz, I was like, whoa, you do look Olmec. I mean, the people who lived in Veracruz, they did look different than people anywhere else in Mexico, and I was surprised by that. So that's something I hope to share on a bigger platform one day, that the Olmec heads really do look like the Olmec people of Veracruz, but the people of Veracruz don't exactly look like people in the rest of Mexico. It's really strange. I'm not exactly sure the explanation behind that. And then building off of the Mesoamerican topic of the Olmec heads, they eventually get into Viracocha, the white or light-skinned god of Colombia and Ecuador, and the story of the light-skinned god Quetzalcoatl. What Graham says is that he doesn't believe that the indigenous people of Mexico, or let's call it Mesoamerica, and South America could be so easily duped into accepting this colonial European myth that was injected into their society, and that this idea of this light-skinned savior god actually was an indigenous American invention, or an indigenous American myth. Well, this is hotly debated because the Spaniards and the Europeans certainly used this to their advantage. They certainly took advantage of this story if it was truly an indigenous American story. Well, what Graham Hancock thinks is that these stories of Viracocha, this light-skinned bearded god, and Quetzalcoatl, this light-skinned bearded feathered serpent god, bringing knowledge to these civilizations during a time of need, is indicative of what may have happened at the end of the Younger Dryas or during the Ice Age, that a civilization arrived that didn't look like the indigenous people and sort of gave them the seed of life that just, boom, started their civilization, and they left. You can see where, okay, maybe this was an indigenous idea. Maybe for some reason, whether it literally happened or didn't, that the story of a person with lighter skin arrives and sort of plants the knowledge of civilization. It's not that dissimilar to the story of the Anunnaki or the story of the Book of Enoch, where these angels come down and plant civilization and teach humans everything. I mean, that's a story that you see all throughout the ancient world. But it's hotly debated as to whether or not this was truly an indigenous story, or whether it was made up by Spaniards to manipulate and sort of tame the Native American people. However, Graham makes a good point in saying that he doesn't think that these natives, with how intelligent they were, and you look at all the feats that they were able to accomplish and all the massive civilizations they built and the megalithic blocks that they moved, and their incredible knowledge of botany and astronomy and medicine, he doesn't think that they could be easily convinced to inject a new European oppressive colonialist god into their religion. Flint, on the other hand, he thinks that acknowledging the existence of a light-skinned white god in the Americas is, without prefacing that this may have been made up by Europeans, he sort of allows Hancock to walk into that, and then Flint, as well as many other people, sort of paint with a broad stroke that those ideas are racist. And so you get this idea floating around that Graham Hancock is a racist. You get these headlines saying that he's a racist, even though he's not, even though Flint knows that he's not. Flint may not necessarily have a problem, at least in the past, in 2022, didn't have a problem with letting these ideas kind of run rampant. Well, that was brought up during the show. And it sort of eventually got ironed out down to the point that Flint said, okay, well, obviously, I don't think that you're a racist, and I never said that you are a racist, which maybe Flint never did, but he's saying that the sources with which Graham Hancock cites when talking about ancient American mythology and religion, those sources are racist. However, we just don't 100% know that as a fact. And so it should always be prefaced when you're bringing up the story of Viracocha, the light-skinned god of Colombia and Ecuador, and Quetzalcoatl, who sort of gets mixed in there. I mean, we know that Quetzalcoatl was a truly indigenous god who the Maya also recognized as Kukulkan, but Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan also get mixed in with this idea of Veracocha as well. So it's hard to differentiate what is accurate there, especially because a lot of the sources that Western society relates to are Spaniard colonizers who wanted nothing more than the indigenous cultures there to sort of dissolve so that they wouldn't be an issue anymore. So that's my review of the first half of the Hancock debate. In the second half, they talk a little bit more about Mesoamerica, and they get into talking about ancient Egypt. So I will review that tomorrow, and it should be up the day after that. But you won't know that until you're seeing it, which is right now where you are on whatever day this is where you are. So anyways, I love doing these more casual videos. I'm kind of settled in from being home from the jungles of Mexico. I'm working on a couple new projects. I have a lot of big stuff coming up. New podcast is coming up, Temple Talk. And I have another podcast, which I didn't even intend beyond 2 days ago to have a second podcast when the first one's not up. But I think this other one that I'm working on is going to be something really, really exciting. And I can't wait to announce it. So let me know in the comments below what you guys thought of at least the first half of this debate on Joe Rogan. Do you think that ultimately this is going to be a productive thing, or do you think that it's just going to go back to being business as usual and the toxicity and the animosity between the two sides will just inevitably grow? Or do you think that this is the start of a new chapter where we can all kind of come together and talk civilly about these topics? And do you think that they'll ever work together? So let me know what you guys think. I'm Luke Caverns. If you like videos like this, if you like videos talking about maybe the ancient Americas and ancient Egypt, well then please like and subscribe for more.